Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. On the 9th of June, the Energy Minister stated, the Prime Minister said it very clearly in his press conference, there are a number of virtues for the clean energy target. It is technology neutral and it lowers electricity prices. So why is the Prime Minister caving in to the member for Warringah by abandoning the clean energy target, a target which would save Australians money on their power bills?
Yeah.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I thank you, Mr Speaker. And Mr Speaker, I'm surprised that the Leader of the Opposition would open up with a question on energy prices on the very day, in fact, within not many minutes, that the Senate has passed the abolition of the limited merits review. A coalition government initiative, an initiative of my government, which the ACCC has said in its report will bring down the cost of energy in the future. Mr Speaker, let's read what the ACCC said about our initiative. The ACCC welcomes the move. Reviews sought by network operators have added billions of dollars to the cost borne by electricity users. The ACCC considers that the removal of this avenue of appeal will help ensure network pricing is moderated in the future. Mr Speaker, that's the action we've taken. We have also taken action to ensure that retail costs come down. We've gone out to the retailers and ensured that they deliver the best deals to their customers. Correct. And thousands of Australian families are paying less for electricity now, saving hundreds of dollars a year in many cases than they were before. And Mr Speaker, of course, the single biggest factor in pushing up electricity prices in recent times has been the price of gas. Why is that? Well, the Labor Party in government allowed gas to be exported from the east coast of Australia without paying any attention to the need to protect the domestic market. We took strong action and we delivered a commitment, a contractual commitment from the energy companies to supply more gas. And as honourable members know, wholesale prices have been coming down as a result.
Will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on
direct
point of
relevance,
order.
Mr Speaker, the question only referred to the clean energy target. Both the quotation and the question were specific to the clean energy target, and the Prime Minister is talking about everything but the clean energy target.
Yeah. I'll call the Prime Minister. Whilst the quote had many aspects in it, it did refer to the clean energy target, but I refer the Manager of Opposition Business to my earlier rulings on the subject matter, and the Prime Minister is speaking about energy. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, the Leader of the Opposition has been in favour of an emissions intensity scheme. He's been in favour of a clean energy target. The only thing they've got in common is that he doesn't understand how either of them work. He doesn't know the difference between a renewables target and an emissions reduction target. One slogan after another. And I say to the Leader of the Opposition, we will deliver a careful energy plan based on engineering and economics, designed to deliver the triple bottom line of affordability, reliability and meeting our international commitments. And that is in stark contrast to the ideology and the idiocy that's been inflicted on us for years by the Australian Labor Party.
The member for Robertson has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on what the government has done to ensure that energy is affordable and reliable for hard-working families and businesses, including in my electorate of Robertson? Is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for her question. Mr Speaker, let me start with the alternate approaches, because we know what it has been from the Labor Party. Oh, we do.
Members on my left.
We know what their approach is.
Members on my left.
Their approach is no engineering and no plan. Massive investment in renewables with no regard to the fact that the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. Force-feeding a massive amount of renewables into the South Australian market without any backup or storage whatsoever. Driving out reliable power to introduce variable power. An extraordinary example of incompetence that resulted in South Australia having, as we know, to the great cost of South Australians, the most expensive and the least reliable electricity in Australia, entirely created by a state Labor government that went into it with eyes open, proudly claiming this was a bold experiment. Well, it was an experiment, Mr. Speaker, and what it demonstrated was that Australians need to know that when they flick the switch, the lights come on, and they need to be able to afford to pay the bill. That's what they managed to establish. Now, Mr. Speaker, what we've done since we came into office is systematically deliver policy that is based on fact and on engineering. And we have delivered lower prices for thousands of Australian customers of electricity prices. Honourable members over there say no, we haven't. Oh yes, we have. Talk to your constituents. They'll tell you about the better deals they're getting. They're getting better deals. And what about all those businesses that depend on gas? They'll tell you that the wholesale price of gas is coming down. Why is that? Because of actions we took. That's why. And what about the biggest single cost
The member for Ballarat.
in a retail customer's electricity bill? It's the cost of the network, the poles and wires. That's about half the bill. And that cost has been going up year in, year out, because the energy companies have been able to game the system and rush off to the courts to appeal against the energy regulator. Did we ever hear the Labor Party call for that to stop? Never. No. The only thing we saw when the Energy Minister did his best to persuade the states to agree to this, steadfast opposition from Labor governments who did not want to see their own energy assets in Queensland, for example, being prejudiced. We've delivered that now. Labor kicked this bill off to a committee. I'm glad it emerged and it has now been passed. So that's what we're doing, bringing downward pressure on electricity prices based on sound policy, facts and engineering, not ideology.
The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy. In his presentation of the Coalition Joint Party Room, the Energy Minister confirmed, and I quote, "A clean energy target lowers prices." Given the Energy Minister told the government's own party room that it would lead to lower power prices, why is the government caving in to the demands of the former Prime Minister, the member for Warringah, by abandoning the clean energy target, which would save Australian money on their power bills?
Members on my left, the Minister for Energy and the Environment has the call.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for Port Adelaide for his question, because he comes from a state which has been run by a Labor government for nearly 16 years and has the highest prices and the least reliable energy system in the country, Mr. Speaker. And the member for Port Adelaide should know in his own electorate, Adelaide Brighton, who had to book a major loss as a result of the lights going out in his own state and his own electorate. Now, when it comes to the clean energy target, that was one of 50 recommendations from the Finkel Review. And we have said we will respond. We will respond to the clean energy target as one of the recommendations. But we've also accepted 49 of the other recommendations, recommendations which will help deliver lower prices and a more reliable system. Reforms like greater notice of closure, so large thermal generators like Hazelwood or like Northern in the minister's own state cannot close with just a few months' notice, but now a minimum of 3 years' notice. That intermittent sources of power, wind and solar, that Labor governments and that the federal opposition have welcomed into the grid without the necessary backup storage will now be required to provide that storage. Putting in place an energy security board to help implement the Finkel recommendations. Importantly, developing our gas resources on a case-by-case basis using scientifically proven methods. not the blanket, mindless bans and moratoriums that the Labor Party has supported in many states and territories. If only the Labor government in the Northern Territory or in Victoria developed their gas resources, then people would have lower prices. Now, Mr Speaker, one thing we won't do on this side is we won't tell lies to the Australian people like the member for Port Adelaide did, like the Leader of the Opposition did in the last sitting fortnight when they came to the dispatch box and said power prices had gone up by $1,000. Well, you won't hear them repeat it anymore. You won't hear them repeat anymore because the Australian Energy Regulator and the Australian Energy Market Commission, in correspondence tabled in this House, have contradicted directly the claims from the Labor Party. So stop making things up. Stop having bogus claims. Repeat it in this House. Have the courage of Braveheart, I say to the Leader of the Opposition. Walk up to the dispatch box and repeat your lies of the past. You won't, Mr Speaker, because you know that it's misleading the Australian people.
The Minister will return to the dispatch box and withdraw that unparliamentary term.
I withdraw that, Mr Speaker, but I do say...
No, you can resume your seat. You can resume your seat. No, you can resume your seat. No, you've finished. The member for Port Adelaide seeking to table the document.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave to table a PowerPoint-headed clean energy target lowers prices from the Energy Minister.
Is leave granted? Leave is not granted. The member for Petrie has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer please update the House on the release of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission's preliminary report on retail electricity prices? Will he explain how the government is working to put downward pressure on energy prices, not just for the people of Petrie, but for all hard-working Australian families and businesses?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Petrie for his question and the hard work he's doing and all members on this side of the House are doing to ensure the government is putting downward pressure on electricity prices for their constituents, Mr Speaker, and for their passion and their commitment to get the right deals for the consumers that they're in their electorates. And I know the member for Petrie would agree with the chairman of the ACCC who said today, if you want to get cheaper electricity, then you've got to focus on what's caused electricity to become more expensive. That was the message from the chairman of the ACCC today, and that is what I asked him to investigate back in April as part of the government's broader package of measures which is designed to put downward pressure on rising electricity prices. And the Commissioner has come back with his draft report to get those facts, and today he has prized open the books of the electricity and energy companies, as he was empowered to do, and he's come back with some facts, and he has commended the government on the action we've been taking to get this job done. First finding, Mr Speaker, amongst many, is he has concluded that Labor's carbon tax drove up prices and we were right to get rid of it, Mr Speaker, as a government. He concluded that the renewable energy targets are about subsidising investment in renewable energy to create a renewables industry with scale, not to bring down prices, and he found they hadn't, Mr Speaker. In fact, they've been pushing prices up. And the customers have been paying for that, Mr Speaker, as he said, smearing costs right across the spectrum. Now, Labor wants a bigger renewable energy target. They're not satisfied with the price increases that are being driven by the current one. They want one of up to 50%, just like they want an emissions reduction target of 45% that would require you to wipe out the emissions of the entire electricity industry, Mr Speaker. That is the plan of the Leader of the Opposition to drive up electricity bills. He's also found that when you blow up coal-fired power stations, which the Labor Party cheered on, it pushes up prices, particularly when you have no plan to replace it with dispatchable baseload power like this government has when it comes to Snowy 2.0. So blowing up coal-fired power stations with no plan is no plan at all, as we saw in South Australia.
Member for Isaacs.
And they also found that the big poles and wires company, while state Labor government stripped dividends off them and allowed them to gold-plate their infrastructure, drove up prices more than anything else. And we have kicked out of the park, Mr Speaker, this free ticket that was provided to those companies, public and private, to do that, as the Prime Minister remarked, has already passed in the Senate today. And he have found that the power retailers have been not treating their loyal customers well and have been mystifying their customers, and the deal we put together with the electricity retailers was about ensuring those customers got a better deal. Sitting down, getting the deal done, as we did with gas, delivering on our plan.
The Treasurer's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I refer to the Prime Minister's previous answer, where he claimed he had obtained—
It's the Leader of the Opposition. Could just start again. If you just, I'm assuming you're directing your questions to the Prime Minister.
Sorry. Sure. I refer to the Prime Minister's previous answer, where he claimed he had obtained contractual commitments from the big gas companies to supply more gas. Given that this is a contractual agreement, can the Prime Minister confirm what penalties will apply to the big gas companies under this contract, and will he table the contracts to the Parliament?
Members on my right, the Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. The agreement that the gas companies entered into is a public document, and honourable members can peruse it at their leisure. But the reality is we've secured that agreement, and that is a very, very significant move. It is, in short, it's an agreement. It's an agreement as a contract. Of course it is. Of course it is. Of course it is an agreement. It's a contract.
Members on my left.
You can use whatever semantics you like. The bottom line is this: we had the character and commitment to bring those gas companies to Canberra and get them to do the right thing by the Australian people. And the Labor Party did nothing. Nothing. The Labor Party allowed gas to be exported from eastern Australia without doing anything to protect Australian consumers.
Member for
and then,
Parramatta.
of course, the member for Port Adelaide was told, Barry Cassidy, that they had no warnings. Nobody told us. It all came as a bolt from the blue. He said, how could it possibly happen that allowing all of this gas to be exported would affect the domestic market? That's what he said on Insiders, back in April it was. And then finally he had to fess up and tell the truth. And the truth, very bluntly, is this: they were warned. They were told that allowing gas exports from the East Coast without any protection for the domestic market would put upward pressure on prices and tighten supply, and that's exactly what happened. And we got to the point where we had, about to become the world's largest exporter of LNG, we got to a point where businesses were looking at shutting down on the East Coast because they couldn't get the gas they needed. And so we had the commitment. We had the commitment to threaten to impose export bans on gas, and negotiated with the companies and secured their commitment.
Resume his seat. Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? Prime Minister's concluded his answer. Just before I call the member for Melbourne, I'd just like to inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon Mr Ross McLean AM, former member for Perth. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you. The member for Melbourne.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. After the government scrapped the carbon price, pollution went up. It went up in 2015, again in 2016 and this year too. You're making climate change worse, but over that time, wholesale electricity prices have doubled too. Prime Minister, instead of letting the climate deniers dictate your energy policy by legislating to ensure coal-fired power stays in the system longer, wouldn't it be better to re-regulate electricity prices, introduce an energy storage target and increase the renewable energy target so that we cut pollution, cut power bills and keep the lights on?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Well, Mr Speaker, I hate to remind the member for Melbourne that when they were in coalition with the Labor government, they were last in power, power prices increased by 100%, Mr Speaker. That was the Greens' legacy. And the confected outrage, the confected moral outrage from the Greens when it comes to climate policy is amazing. Because we know when those members on this side of the House were dealing with their constituents with Cyclone Debbie, and when the members on this side of the House were dealing with their constituents who were dealing with the fires in Sydney, who was out there on their soapbox blaming climate change, Mr Speaker. They member for Melbourne, and that was disgraceful. That was absolutely disgraceful, Mr Speaker. Now, it might be an inconvenient truth for the member for Melbourne that emissions in Australia are at their lowest level in 27 years, Mr Speaker. Their lowest level in 27 years in terms of GDP and per capita. Lowest level in 27 years. Even the electricity sector has been falling in the last 2 quarters. Now, the member for Melbourne refers to storage. It was the Prime Minister of this government, the Turnbull government, that for the first time put the issue of storage at the top of the policy agenda. What did the Labor Party do in South Australia about storage? Nothing. And now they have to spend $110 million on diesel generators that don't work when it's hot, Mr Speaker. They have to take more coal than before from Victoria across the Hayward Interconnector. And they have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayers' money building a new gas-fired power station. What did the Labor Party ever do about storage? What did the Greens ever say about storage? That is why on this side of the House we've invested more than $200 million through a vast array of projects on storage, and we're investing in Snowy 2.0, Mr Speaker. But at the end of the day, if the lights don't stay on, then there's no point about reducing emissions. Our focus is on reliability and affordability while staying true to our international commitments. And that is why we've commissioned the expert advice from AEMO and from the ACCC, and it's on that advice that we have been acting to lower people's power prices.
The member for Dunkley has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Energy. Will the Minister update the House on action the government is taking to ensure that hard-working Australian families and businesses, like those in my electorate of Dunkley, have a secure and affordable gas supply? Are there any alternative approaches?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Dunkley for his question. I know he's deeply committed to lowering the power bills of his constituents and ensuring a more reliable supply. And that is why we've taken action on a number of fronts, recognising there is no single silver bullet to lower power prices. As the Prime Minister mentioned, we have been successful in passing through the Senate the abolition of the limited merits review process. In Labor's own election document in 2016, they said that, quote, power bills have skyrocketed, and this has been a result of massive investments in networks, poles and wires. But what did they do when they were in government? Absolutely nothing, Mr Speaker. That is why we have now abolished the limited merits review process. The work we've done with the retailers, which can save a household $1,000 or more by changing retailers or changing contracts. The investment in storage is now another important point and reform in order to reduce the volatility that has been driving our power prices. And when it comes to gas, the Labor Party did nothing when they were in office. The member for Port Adelaide has now admitted that they knew that power prices would rise as a result of the tight supply on the East Coast by setting up large amounts of export of gas without the necessary supply for the domestic market. So we spoke to AEMO and we spoke to the ACCC, and we received their advice about what would be required to ensure there is no domestic shortfalls in 2018 and 2019. And we were told that there could be potentially a shortfall of 107 petajoules in 2018 and 102 petajoules in 2019. As a result of the work that we did, we were able to secure agreement from the gas companies to ensure that there won't be those shortfalls in those years. But the long-term solution is to get more gas out of the ground, and that will only occur if the states develop their gas. The Northern Territory is sitting on 200 years' worth of supply. The Andrews government is sitting on 40 years' worth of supply. In New South Wales, if Narrabri was developed, it could provide up to 50% of New South Wales gas. And the chief scientist himself has made it very clear that you can develop unconventional gas resources in a scientifically proven and environmentally sustainable way on a case-by-case basis. So I say to the Labor Party, use your good offices with your Labor comrades in the other states. Get their support to lifting these bans and moratoriums. But they're only costing jobs and they're only sending prices higher. And as a result of our interventions in the market, we are doing more every day to secure lower gas prices for Australian families and businesses.
Member for Whitlam will cease interjecting. The member for Sydney has the floor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has said a clean energy target would, and I quote, certainly work. There is no question it would work. Does the Prime Minister stand by that statement, or has the member for Warringah been drafted to lead the government in developing a new energy policy?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for a question. Mr Speaker, there are many approaches to energy policy that can work. The question is ensuring that you adopt the best. That's the task of government. To get beyond the slogans and the three-letter acronyms that honourable members opposite don't understand, and to have a policy that works and have the one that works best. That's our commitment. Engineering and economics, not three-letter acronyms and terms that honourable members opposite can laugh about but do not understand.
The member for Parkes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Agriculture, Water Resources and Northern Australia. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House steps the government has taken to alleviate energy prices that threaten the ongoing growth in the agriculture sector, and is he aware of any alternative approaches?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question and understand his concerns he would have in alternative policies, such as a 45% emissions reduction target by the Labor Party, which would actually put blue-collar workers out of a job, such as a 50% renewable target by the Labor Party, which would put blue-collar workers out of a job, such as this ridiculous process of net zero emissions by 2050. There'll be net jobs by 2050 under a Labor Party. And I can understand how the member for Parkes would be standing up for his people, standing up for the people in Cobar, for the people in Gilgandra, the weatherboard 9 in Gilgandra, for the people in Wilcannia, for the people in Dubbo, for the people in Bogan, how they'd be standing up for the people in Bogan. And I can understand why they'd start making fun of Bogan. I can understand why, because they've turned their back on all the working class people. They now think working class people are a bit of a joke, something to be made fun of. That's the sort of people they are. They've also turned their back on the people of Blacktown. They've turned their back on the people of Ipswich. They've turned their back on the people of Geelong. And the Leader of the Opposition turns his back on this parliament every day. But we have a plan. We have a plan to the member of Parkes, the honourable member. We believe that there should be better transferability, there should be between retailers, and we brought that process into effect. With the Prime Minister, myself, the Energy Minister and the Treasurer, we brought that into effect. We believe in coal-fired power, we really do. We believe in coal-fired power more than the member for Hunter does, who's given up on coal workers, given up on power workers, more than the member for Shortland. And I've seen your polling, Your polling's gone through the floor, his polling's gone through the floor. They've given up on it. I've seen what happens to the blue-collar workers. They know that the Labor Party no longer represents them. The member for Townsville just sits back idly as jobs go off. She doesn't stand up for the people of Townsville. She no longer believes in the people of Townsville. They've given up. They've given up on Augathilla for Annandale. They've given up on Burke for Balmain. They've given up on St George for St Kilda. They only have one idea. They want
Deputy
green
Prime
votes.
Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, while you know our view on whether he should be speaking at all, if he's going to speak, he should be relevant to the question.
The Deputy Prime Minister is being relevant to the question.
And, Mr Speaker, The reality is that we need cheaper power for irrigation. We need cheaper power for meat processing. We still believe that blue-collar workers deserve a job. The Labor Party now believe that blue-collar workers are politically incorrect. Politically incorrect. There is nothing that shows that when we see them come forward and talk about targets that are going to put working men and women out of a job, shut down the manufacturing industry, put more people out of a job, we are doing everything in our power to try and keep these people, because you can either have cheap power or you can have cheap wages or no jobs. We believe in cheap power and we're going to bring it about.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. On the 10th of August, the Prime Minister promised to conduct an investigation into whether Bruce Bilson had breached ministerial standards by lobbying MPs on matters relevant to his previous portfolio. Can the Prime Minister verify this letter, posted a few minutes ago by 7:30, that the investigation did not speak to any ministers, did not interview any current MPs and did not even review the public documents which are tabled in this parliament? Can the Prime Minister confirm the investigation involved Mr Bilson simply giving an assurance that he had complied with the code?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I will take that question on notice and I'll respond in due course when I have advice from the Secretary.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Speaker, given that answer, I'd seek leave to table the relevant letter from the Secretary of Prime Minister and Cabinet.
Leave granted. Leave is not granted. The member for Grindler will cease interjecting. The member for Barara has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Will the minister update the House on how the government, as part of international efforts, is working to peacefully resolve tensions arising from North Korea's illegal nuclear and ballistic missile program?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Barara for his question, and I commend him for recently hosting a forum that was attended by well over 100 Korean Australians and others, at which I spoke and addressed a number of these issues which are of great concern to all Australians. North Korea's ballistic missile and nuclear weapons tests are provocative, threatening to other nations and illegal in that they are in direct defiance of numerous UN Security Council resolutions prohibiting such tests. Australia has joined with other nations, including South Korea, the United States, Japan, China and others, in a collective strategy whereby we are maximising diplomatic and economic pressure on North Korea in a peaceful campaign to compel North Korea back to the negotiating table. On the diplomatic front, an increasing number of nations are making it clear that North Korean ambassadors are no longer welcome in their capitals, and we have seen nations including Spain, Mexico, Peru, Kuwait, Egypt, Philippines and others expelling the North Korean ambassador. Indeed, there hasn't been a North Korean ambassador in Australia since 2008. On the economic front, we support the tough, comprehensive set of sanctions that are being implemented by all the Permanent Five, particularly China and the United States, and we urge all countries to abide by the UN Security Council resolutions on sanctions. Last week, Defence Minister Senator Marise Payne and I attended the regular 2+2 South Korean meeting with our counterparts, Minister Kang and Minister Song, and we also met with the Director of National Intelligence Service in South Korea for a lengthy briefing. We travelled to the DMZ, met with UN Command, as I know the Leader of the Opposition has recently. We met with General Brooks, who is the Commander, UN Command, US Forces Korea and ROK US Combined Forces. We reiterated our solidarity with South Korea and our support for even tougher sanctions against North Korea, because it must be deterred from its illegal tests and compelled back to the negotiating table so we can achieve a denuclearised Korean peninsula. Mr Speaker, North Korea's belligerent and threatening response will only strengthen our resolve to find a peaceful resolution to the rising tensions on the Korean Peninsula that have been caused entirely by North Korea's provocative and illegal behaviour. The Australian government, and I'm sure I'm joined by the opposition, urges North Korea to abandon its illegal tests, to return to the negotiating table and to direct its resources and energy into alleviating the suffering of the North Korean people.
Good answer. The member for Greenway.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. NBN Co has recently revealed that it spent $177 million of taxpayers' money buying over 15 million metres of new copper. Why is the government still investing in 20th century copper when Australia needs a 21st century national broadband network?
Members on my left, the Prime Minister has the call.
It'll still be rolling out to their first home under you.
Members on my left.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker. The honourable member might reflect on the fact that the NBN Co is activating more customers every 10 days than the Labor Party did in 6 years. Quite an accomplishment. Quite an accomplishment. 51,000 customers, paying customers in 6 years. That's what Labor did. Now, had we persisted with Labor's failed project, it would have taken between 6 and 8 years longer and $30 billion more. Right now, the project is on track to be completed.
Prime Minister will resume his seats. The level of interjections is far too high. The member for Parramatta is warned, as is the member for Wakefield. The Prime Minister will resume his answer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, right now the project is on track to be completed by 2020. It is on track, it's on budget. The rollout is proceeding on a scale never before seen in Australian telecommunications. Now, Mr Speaker, I want honourable members to understand that the government recognises that there have been concerns among customers about not getting the speed that they were advertised by their retail service providers. And that has been a consequence, as the company has made clear, of the retail service providers like Telstra and Optus and TPG and dozens of others not buying sufficient bandwidth from NBN Co to support their customer base. And the company is taking steps to ensure that there is full transparency on that point, as indeed is the ACCC. The NBN was one of the greatest train wrecks created by the Labor Party, and that's saying something. It was a shambles. And what we have done is turned it around. We're getting it built and getting it completed. And Mr Speaker, to hear the honourable member stand up and somehow or other say that copper is bad, I mean, really, the honourable member,
for Lindsay,
doing her homework, would know, Mr Speaker, that right around the world, telcos are rolling out broadband infrastructure on a multi-technology basis, using fibre, using copper, using a combination of them. It really would expect the Labor Party to do better than this. They should focus on the real objective, which is to get every Australian connected. NBN Co is well on the way to doing that, and to ensuring that customers get the service they order on the terms they're paying for. That's what we're seeking to do, and honourable members opposite should do well to abandon these Conrovian rhetoric of years ago and focus on the technology issues of today.
The member for Capricornia.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment. Will the minister outline to the House why it is important that leaders of unions and employer organisations act in a way that promotes integrity and respect? Is the minister aware of reports about intimidation, threats or harassment of Australian workers and their families by members of registered organisations?
The Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Capricornia for her question. Mr Speaker, in the last fortnight we've seen some of the worst examples of bad CFMEU behaviour that we've seen in a very long time. In fact, it's probably more than we've ever experienced before, at Oakey North, at the Glencore picket at Oakey North in her electorate. The threats being shouted by the CFMEU at the Glencore workers are quite frankly beyond the pale, Mr Speaker. They would shock most members of this House, calling out to employees legitimately going to work that they wish that they would have head-on collisions on their way home from work. But even worse than that, Mr Speaker, saying that these workers, the CFMEU workers, would rape the children of the workers at Oakey North at the Glencore precinct there. Now, Mr Speaker, I know that the Labor Party is prepared to put up with most stuff from the CFMEU. They're prepared to tolerate almost anything. But there are many people in this House, Mr Speaker, with children and probably with grandchildren. And how could anybody in this House imagine a threat being made to them going into their workplace that anyone would rape any one of our children by a union official because we were going about our business? Now, I would ask the Labor members to simply take pause for a moment and imagine how horrific that is for the father or mother of any child. These are real threats. I've seen the videos, I've seen the Facebook posts. The member for Bendigo continues to defend the CFMEU in this place. When is enough going to be enough for the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, to stand up to the CFMEU? We know that he's taken $8 million in donations from the CFMEU since he was the Leader of the Labor Party. It's time for the Labor Party to say no to any more donations from the CFMEU. It's time to get the CFMEU off the national conference, the state conference, the pre-selection processes, the policy fora of the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. Bob Hawke had the backbone to stand up to the BLF. It's time this Leader of the Labor Party had the backbone to stand up to the CFMEU, Mr Speaker, because it goes to a question of if this Leader of the Opposition is not prepared to stand up to the CFMEU, despite all their heinous crimes, how will he stand up for Australia's national interests on the overseas stage? How will he stand up for Australia's national interests in Australia and beyond if he's not even prepared to say enough is enough to the CFMEU?
Yes. The member for Dobell.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. We are now in the 5th year of this Prime Minister's mismanagement of the NBN. Is the Prime Minister aware that students at the Central Coast Rudolf Steiner School in Fountaindale can't connect to the NBN, even though Fountaindale has supposedly had the NBN since September last year? What sort of incompetence means that the cemetery behind the school has an NBN connection, but the school doesn't?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for a question. I'm certainly happy if she's able to raise the specific matter, specific customers' details with me. I will make sure it goes to the minister and to the NBN Co. What I can say, Mr Speaker, if honourable members care to pay attention to the NBN's weekly rollout report, which I do, an example of transparency on behalf of my government, which was no counterpart under the Labor Party, I might say. But every week the numbers go up, and there are currently over 6 million premises that are able to connect, and just under 3 million have services that are connected. So the rollout is going at great pace, and I'm sure the matter that the honourable members raised will be able to be dealt with. And I'll take the opportunity now, Mr Speaker, to respond to a question from the member for Watson. He asked me whether, in respect of the complaint he'd raised about Bruce Bilson, whether the secretary of my department had interviewed any ministers as opposed to former ministers. The answer is I'm advised he did not, and I table the letter that the secretary of my department wrote to me on the 4th of September.
The member for Chisholm has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Withdraw that out.
My question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the Minister update the House on action the government is taking
Member
to
for
protect—
Chisholm will resume her seat. The member for Grayndler and the Leader of the House will cease interjecting. I'm trying to hear the member for Chisholm. Member for Chisholm will begin her question again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the Minister update the House on action the government is taking to protect Australian families from criminal gang members? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I want to thank the member for Chisholm very much for the hard work that she's doing in her community and the support that she provides to the government's program to cancel the visas of Australians, of people who are in Australia who have committed serious offences against Australians. Now, the government's been very deliberate in saying that we want to find people that have come here on visas. Abiding by the conditions of those visas is a condition of their presence in our country, and when they break the conditions of those visas, that is, when they commit criminal offences against Australians, we cancel those visas. Now, I'm pleased to report to the House that the number of cancellations is now over 3,000 under Section 501 of the Migration Act, and it includes, Mr Speaker, a cancellation of 154 outlaw motorcycle gang members. Now, what we know of outlaw motorcycle gang members, Mr Speaker, is that they are involved as the biggest distributors of ice and amphetamines in our country. They import, they manufacture, they distribute, and they are involved in serious crimes otherwise, including, Mr Speaker, providing muscle for the CFMEU on building sites around the country. Now, the Labor Party scoffs at this, but we know that the price of a unit in Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane is up by 30% because of the involvement of the CFMEU. Now, does the Leader of the Opposition have any regard for that whatsoever? No, he does not, Mr Speaker, because this Leader of the Opposition will always stand up for the union bosses over the union workers. And, Mr Speaker, we saw recently, only on the 6th of October, an incident that occurred at a mining site in Queensland where the CFMEU was on strike, and there was this tirade of abuse that the Leader of the House mentioned before from the CFMEU members to family members of workers that were working on this mine site. It was absolutely disgraceful, the language and the intimidation that took place. The police had warned the CFMEU members about this, but who do you think should turn up to provide moral support to the CFMEU? It was the godfather of the union movement in this country, Mr Speaker. We refer to him as the Leader of the Opposition in this place, but the godfather of the union movement turned up to provide moral encouragement to the criminals within the CFMEU membership. They have provided $3 million from the CFMEU to the Labor Party since he was elected Leader of the Opposition. And, Mr Speaker, no wonder Australians look to this Leader of the Opposition and recognise that he does not have the moral fortitude to become Prime Minister of this country. It is clear, Mr Speaker, that this man supports the criminals within the CFMEU, not one word against the conduct of those people, and it just shows that the character of this Leader of the Opposition is absolutely lacking.
The Minister's time has concluded. The member for Dobell.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Elizabeth and her family live in Warnervale in my electorate. Is the Prime Minister aware that her whole street can't connect to the NBN, even though her suburb has supposedly had it for years? The Communications Minister promised that Elizabeth Street would have an operational NBN micronode back in February, but 8 months later she's still waiting. Given we are now in the 5th year of this Prime Minister's mismanagement of the NBN, isn't it clear that the Australians are suffering with a second-rate NBN because this Prime Minister is so out of touch?
The Minister for Urban Infrastructure.
Well, I do thank the member for her question, because, of course,
members on my left,
with over 6 million premises now able to connect to the NBN, the rate at which the NBN is being rolled out is unprecedented. Some 35,000 customers are connecting to the NBN every week. some 35,000 customers are connecting to the NBN every week. After Labor was in power for 4 years, they'd achieved barely 50,000. In 4 years, all they could achieve was 50,000. We are rolling out this network at 35,000 premises a week. The member was not here. The member was lucky not to be here to see the rank incompetence of the Labor minister who was responsible for dreaming up this scheme without any concern at all about how it was practically going to be implemented. And in the typical Labor way, when they left government, when they shuffled helplessly out of government, they'd spent $6 billion and a mere 50,000 premises around the country could connect. It was a chaotic, incompetent mess. Virtually nobody on the board knew anything about telecommunications. We had to make very significant changes to the board and the management team. And we're now getting on with delivering this network, with rolling it out. By 2020, this rollout is on track to be delivered. That is an extraordinary achievement, and it's no thanks to this incompetent rabble from whom we inherited. This incompetent rabble from whom we inherited a project that was in chaotic disarray. Now, Mr. Speaker, of course, in any rollout of this scale, there will be customer experiences that are not what we want. That's why there's a lot of work going on to understand those specific situations and to deal with them. And if the member wants to give me specific instances, of course we'll look at it. But remember this, when we came to government, the NBN was in disarray. There was no plan to get it done. We're getting it done every year, meeting the targets, getting it rolled. 6 million premises now able to connect. That is delivery.
The member for Fairfax has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Justice and Minister assisting the Prime Minister for counter-terrorism. Will the minister update the House on measures the government is taking to protect our community from shocking crimes? And are there any threats to these reforms?
The Minister for Justice.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the member for that question. Now, in this session of Parliament, the Parliament is going to have to deal with two very important issues in relation to community safety. First is the toughest crackdown on child sex offenders that we have seen in this country in a generation, including mandatory minimum sentences for the worst offenders. We also need to deal with illegal firearms trafficking. The government plans to crack down on it and will be putting legislation back before the Senate for the fourth time, again including minimum mandatory sentences for people who smuggle guns in this country. Now, when we introduced the first tranche of legislation dealing with child sex tourism, when we introduced that, the Leader of the Opposition stood up in Parliament within 2 hours and pledged the Labor Party's support. Now we announced the toughest crackdown on child sex offenders last month, yet the Labor Party still has not decided where they stand on this issue. Still has not decided. I mean, seriously, what's to prevaricate about? We want pedophiles off the streets, and we believe this legislation deserves bipartisan support. Everybody does. Well, why can't you say you support it now? Stand up and say you support it. Is it really that difficult?
The Minister will resume his seat. Minister resume his seat. The Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Of all the personal claims that can be made— No, just wait. Of all the personal claims that can be directed at members of Parliament across the chamber, what the minister is claiming now What the minister is...
The Manager of Opposition Business resume his seat. The minister will cease interjecting. I'm trying to hear the point of order from the Manager of Opposition Business. The Manager of Opposition Business with a point of order. I'd like to know what the point of order is.
It's making reflections on members. The minister specifically pointed to members along the front bench of the chamber and made specific allegations about their view on whether or not pedophiles should be locked up. Now, I've got to say, when you're pointing at people like that and you're talking about their position on an issue like this, that is a personal reflection and the most vile sort of accusation someone can make in this place.
Members on both sides will... I've listened very carefully to the Manager of Opposition Business, and members will appreciate I extended significant latitude to him to make the point he was making. I'm very concerned about reflections on members. I was listening very closely to the minister. He's talking about legislation that's before the parliament and what the aims. I don't even need interjections agreeing with me, frankly, when I'm trying to address the House. And he's talking about the aims of the government legislation in that regard. So, in that sense, strictly he's in order, but I do say to him I'd like him to take care with the language he uses in his answer. The minister has the call.
Well, the allegation I was making is very clear, Mr Speaker, and that is after a month since we've introduced this legislation, the Labor Party still cannot say if they support it or not. That is just a statement of fact. And if they want to get up now after my answer and say whether they support it or not, I'm sure the government will facilitate that opportunity. That is exactly what the Leader of the Opposition did when we introduced our largest crackdown, when we took passports off pedophiles within 2 hours of us announcing that legislation. Now, Mr Speaker, this is a very important point about the government's priorities.
Member for McEwen.
We believe it is vitally important that the most serious sex offenders serve time in prison. We believe that people responsible for gun smuggling serve time in prison. Yet the Labor Party don't know what they think about the first proposal, and they actively oppose the second proposal. For 3 times we've introduced into the Senate legislation in relation to illegal firearms trafficking, and 3 times in a row the Labor Party has joined with the Greens to block it. Now they've got a choice to make in this session of Parliament. Will they prioritise community safety? Do they believe that people who smuggle guns should serve time in prison or not? Well, we'll support it then. It is incredibly straightforward. These are decision points for the Leader of the Opposition. What does he prioritise? Does he want to join with the government on these important pieces of legislation for community safety, or does he want to prevaricate, not knowing where he stands, and actively impose the other?
The member for Greenway.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that because of his mismanagement of the NBN, Australia has now slipped to 50th place in the world for internet speeds, behind even Kenya, Russia and New Zealand? How are Australians expected to compete in a global digital economy with second-rate broadband? Isn't it clear that Australians are suffering with a second-rate NBN because this Prime Minister is so out of touch?
The Minister for Urban Infrastructure.
I am delighted to have the opportunity to respond to this particular misleading question, because we are told by the Labor Party that apparently there is some problem with, according to the fact that under an internet speed survey conducted by the company Akamai, Australia is doing worse than Kenya. Our speed is slightly less in average speeds in megabits per second than Kenya. There is one small fact that the Labor Party has neglected to mention in pointing out this report. Approximately 2% of the population in Kenya can connect to broadband. 2%. So we've got one country where a small number of private sector, one country where a small number of private sector providers provide a high-speed broadband service. We have a network which is now available to 6 million premises and will be available to 10 million by 2020. We are providing a high-speed network that is broadly available to the entire population, and the speed which is available on NBN is materially faster than on other networks. And as the percentage of people on NBN increase, then the average speed is going to increase. So this is a very good example of the highly misleading kind of commentary we have from the Labor Party, choosing and deliberately distorting a report and failing to point out the most obvious point. Ours is a network which is designed to serve the entire population, and they compare it to another country. Now, I want also to have a look, Mr Speaker, at what's happening in the electorate of Dobell, because we had a couple of questions from the member for Dobell earlier today. Now, how many premises were connected to the NBN in Dobell when the Labor Party left government? Was it 10,000? No. Was it 1,000? No. Do you know how much it was? It was 191. 191. And I'll tell you something else. I'll tell you something else. After these geniuses have been charged with the fibre rollout for 4 years, 0 was on fibre. All of them were on satellite. You people are a hopeless, incompetent rabble. You know nothing about broadband. You should keep your heads under the desk.
Members on my right. The member for Greenway seeking to table the documents.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave to table the extracts from the State of the Internet Report Q1 2017, which shows global rankings for Kenya of 43, New Zealand of 20.
Is leave granted? Leave is not granted. The member for Goldstone.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister update the House on how the Coalition's prudent economic management enables the government to list vital drugs which save and improve lives? And how does this compare with other approaches?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Goldstein, who's been a strong advocate for the listing of new drugs such as Kalydeco and Entresto and Stelara, which have helped people with many different conditions. In order to do this, though, of course, there has to be a very solid approach to economic management. There are two fundamentals to the way in which we've been able to do this. Firstly, the way in which the Prime Minister and the Treasurer and other members of the government have been able to deliver strong jobs growth and strong economic growth of this year predicted to be 2.75%. In addition to that, we've been able to make a fundamental agreement with Medicines Australia to ensure savings of $1.8 billion in medicine costs, which will be reinvested fully to allow us to list new medicines in a timely manner. This has been a unique agreement which has brought together both medicines, economic management and patient care. In that context, only recently, last week, the Prime Minister and I were fortunate to be able to list a new drug, ibrutinib. Ibrutinib is a drug which supports patients with leukemia and also with lymphoma. And what that means is that we have a drug that would otherwise have cost $187,000 a year for patients, available for $38.80 or $6.30 per script. A dramatic change to bring this life-saving, literally life-saving drug into the reach of all Australians who qualify and require it. It follows on from what we were able to do not long ago with the listing of Opdivo. Now, Opdivo is an extraordinary immunotherapy. It's part of the new wave of immunotherapy which is literally bringing the opportunity of life to people from around the world. On this occasion, it was available for lung and kidney disease. 4,500 Australians. 4,500 Australians at a cost of $1.1 billion will be able to access a drug which for them would have been over $130,000 per annum. So that's one approach. That's about listing all of the drugs which are recommended by the PBAC. The alternative approach, when you don't manage the economy properly, is what we saw under the previous government, where they deliberately deferred, extraordinarily, drugs for schizophrenia, for asthma, for pulmonary disease, for endometriosis and for IVF, which have all been approved by the PBAC. So if you want a definition of good economic and good health management, that's what we're doing. If you want a definition of bad economic management and medi-fraud, nothing more than medi-fraud, it's their approach to listing drugs on that side. We're doing real things to help real patients.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice.